Welcome to our Dream Deferred, a podcast that asks big questions and engages remarkable minds from a wide range of fields to help get underneath our unfulfilled American dream. I'm Tracy Waring-Evans.
And I'm Karen Heller-Key.
We're colleagues working in human services, a field that works in every community to ensure Americans have the building blocks to achieve well-being. People in our field work to remove the barriers that get in the way of well-being, and that means getting to root causes, including the ways our shared beliefs, culture, and social systems and structures make it difficult or impossible for people and groups to ever achieve the stability and prosperity we all want and are promised. These past few years, as our country has become more fragmented and long-standing biases have come into plain sight, we've searched for ways to understand what we're experiencing more deeply and to benefit from perspectives that can help us envision a path forward. Our Dream Deferred is our way of engaging with important and diverse voices and bringing them to our field and beyond. Across Season 1, we will weave conversations into a picture to help us see anew where we are, how we got here, and how we can find a new way forward.
Welcome to our latest episode of Our Dream Deferred. I'm your host, Karen Heller-Key, joined by my co-host and learning partner, Tracy Waring-Evans. Our guest today is Philip Howard, a professor of sociology, information technology, and international affairs at Oxford University, and the author of Lie Machines: How to Save Democracies from Troll Armies, Deceitful Robots, and Junk News. Both Tracy and I believe it's imperative that we better understand the ways in which social media and artificial intelligence are distorting our sense of reality, and too often are being used to bring out and sustain rage and fear. Phil's unique ability to pair the study of new information technologies with the science of sociology helps us deconstruct and explicitly name these forces and show how they're used to distort our work in human services and for the common good. By better understanding the lie machines we hold in our hands, we're excited to get Phil's insights on how we as public sector leaders and engaged citizens can combat weaponized online disinformation campaigns and build thriving, inclusive communities. Welcome to the show, Phil. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Phil Howard. I'm a professor at Oxford University.
Welcome to our Dream Deferred. We usually start by asking our guests about a big dream they had for themselves growing up and how that dream was impacted by what we call the American dream. We know you're Canadian born and have also lived in the US and now in the UK. As a kid, what was one of your big dreams? And we're just curious, is there such a thing as the Canadian dream?
Yeah, what a good question. Of course, the answer is that there are probably several Canadian dreams, just like there are several American dreams. I think when I was growing up, one of the big dreams that Trudeau Sr. had for the country was that everybody who was born French-speaking would learn English, and everybody who was English-speaking would learn French, and learning a language would be one way of uniting the country. And I've sort of inherited that. I think it's a great route to building empathy, learning other languages, and understanding other cultures is part of what we need to do as citizens. I think that living in the States, I held on to that, in that I think the parts of the U.S. where public agencies can speak to many communities, even in their own languages, if need be, seem to do a better job at providing public services and serving civic needs. I would say that's true globally, too.
So your academic background and your current role at Oxford, they're multidisciplinary, working at that intersection, really, of social science and technology, which is what drew Karen and I think to your work in the first place. So could you tell us a little bit about that work and about the institute that you lead?
Certainly. The Oxford Internet Institute and the program on democracy and technology is really about studying the information infrastructure and social systems at the same time. I think a lot of us in the social sciences have come to see that it no longer really makes sense to study a political process or study a sociological process without telling the story of social media or understanding people's media habits, because how a citizen interacts with a state, or how they meet each other, or how they learn or express disappointment or dislike, all that stuff happens on the internet these days. And so To collect evidence over social media is challenging. To turn the evidence you collect into sensible policy recommendations is challenging. And then, teaching civil society groups or policymakers to use evidence from the internet is also, one of the big modern challenges for those of us who teach in universities. So this center and this program is really about trying to teach about and study social systems and technical systems at the same time, just to try to do them both in a multi-method way.
We actually first saw one of your lectures in 2017, and when you were helping to connect what was happening in the realm of politics in the US and also in the UK with what was happening online in some really compelling ways. Obviously, your work has continued to evolve since then as the realities are continuing to morph, but we'd like to lay the important groundwork that you helped with at that time. So help our listeners understand several key terms that you use. So what are bots? What are trolls? And what is computational propaganda?
Well, I'll go in reverse order. Computational propaganda is the use of algorithms, usually social media algorithms, to deliver stuff that has political spin, is conspiratorial, sensationalist, extremist political content, to deliver it in very strategic ways to sometimes particular audiences that will be activated by it. And the people who do this stuff are sometimes called trolls. I mean, they're the ones who generate the content, who figure out how to game the social media algorithms, how to game social media systems. They're the ones who usually can express the vile hatred, produce hate speech that targets prominent public figures unfairly, and they sort of degrade the quality of public conversation. Often they either try to make us feel outraged, or they cause outrage by the things they say, deliberately provocative. And social media companies, several of the firms, have been trying their best to prevent this from happening. Of course, with the latest stuff with the Facebook whistleblower, we're learning that internally, Facebook at least, knew that there were design flaws that were having an impact on how young women perceive their bodies, on how hate speech was traveling across the internet. And so trolls and social media algorithms have done a fair amount of, I think, damage to many public conversations.
Last year, you published a book called Lie Machines with the subtitle How to Save Democracy from Troll Armies, Deceitful Robots, Junk News Operations, and Political Operatives. So to get us started on the book, what exactly is a lie machine?
Well, I use the term lie machine to refer to the big complex of technologies and people, right? So it's about both of those things again. And the process by which somebody produces a lie, markets it over social media and distributes it, and then delivers it, really, to particular users, particular social media accounts. And lie machines, they can be quite large. Sometimes they involve regular PR agencies based in Toronto, New York, London. Sometimes they involve foreign governments, often military units that have been retasked to do social media. Sometimes they involve volunteers, regular volunteers who have a bone to pick with a particular public policy and organize themselves using a fairly standard toolkit. But in almost all cases, it's the reason I call them a machine is because they can grow quite large. They can involve just a few $1,000s to launch an immense communications campaign that can do real damage to policy debates.
In writing about lie machines, thinking of it as a machine, you describe the core components of that machine, and you've just alluded to the three core components: production, who produces the lies or disinformation, distribution, how they are spread, and then marketing, how they're amplified. So could you describe those components a bit and relate them to what our listeners are experiencing and interacting with every day? So whether or not they realize that they're actually interacting with those components and with the live machines phenomenon. So could you talk about those components a little bit?
Certainly. I think the book goes into one of the biggest lie machines around a couple of elections, the 2016 certainly election, and they involved a production team based in St. Petersburg, based in Russia, that developed some personalities who were fake U.S. voters who were on social media for several years, producing content about their soccer games they were going to, their favorite soap operas, and posting pictures of flowers, right? So these are personalities that actually got into real social networks of real citizens. And so the production process became about figuring out what hot button issues would really activate American voters. And as you can imagine, they were on race, issues to do with race and religion and abortion policy. There's a range of things that are just polarizing issues. And these production teams decided to do the work of polarizing by getting these accounts to wake up one day and start talking politics. And so that production part usually evolves around very polarizing issues. The distribution part involves figuring out whether you want to use Instagram or WhatsApp or Facebook to deliver your message to cultivate communities. And I think at the time it was mostly about Facebook. That was the primary venue for creating new communities around specific issues. These days, it may actually be more about Instagram, maybe more about Twitter and WhatsApp. The footnote I'd offer here is that we don't actually know because none of these firms don't really share data with independent researchers. So we think the action has moved from Facebook to Instagram, but we're not really sure. Then the marketing system involves, it involves paying the firms to distribute content in strategic ways just through regular ads. And so there were several examples of funny things that came out of the 2016 election, like the Russians bought political ads with rubles, right, in their own currency, and Facebook still didn't notice that as something that was odd. So there's a production side and there's a strategic distribution side. It's like a lot of other contemporary communications campaigns. They work well when there's a lot of thought put into the strategy.
So your work helps us see how technology, especially artificial intelligence, can be used to exploit our own human vulnerabilities, both things that we have as individual cognitive biases and those across social divisions. And in the US, that shows up lots of times in things that are deeply rooted in our structural systems, including systemic racism. How does artificial intelligence, how does that machine learning get deployed to bring out the worst in us? And do you have a sense of why race is such an ideal attack surface?
Unfortunately, race is an ideal attack surface because it can be easy for machine learning systems to pick up on our fears and our biases and to replicate those fears and biases. Now, AI systems don't have to do that. It should be possible to imagine how to use machine learning, especially for public service and public administration, to try to redress social inequalities, to lighten the burden. But I think we've seen many examples now, time and time again, of how bias in a training data set becomes a source of bias in the outcomes of whatever we're analyzing. And I think in the case of social media, it's often about identifying the kinds of articles that your friends or family might like in a news feed, and sending you that same content, even if you might disagree with your friends and family. And so some people call this the filter bubble, right? We live in a social context that Facebook can read, the social media firms can read with their AI, their machine learning systems, and that allows them to they would say it allows them to customize their content for you. Now, there are other researchers who say that filter bubbles don't really exist, that it's much more about self-selection. And this, Tracy, is what you were hinting at with the problem of sort of cognitive biases we all have. So the behavioral researchers tell us that we all like information that reinforces some decision we've made in the past. We don't like information that challenges us, that challenges some decision or suggests we might have been wrong. We tend to like political figures who look like us or sound like us or have our demographic background. And social media firms are actually designed to take advantage of these cognitive biases, right, to present us with the content. So if we know we like certain topics, social media platforms will provide more content relevant on that topic. I think one of the great challenges for us, maybe in the years ahead, will be to figure out how to do social media in a way that doesn't privilege the sensational and the extremist stuff and doesn't fit with our cognitive biases. There must be a way to build social media that allows us to identify points of consensus or empathy or points of commonality. That's at least the social media platform I'd like to see us using.
I'm curious what your thoughts are about phrase race to the bottom of the brainstem and the idea that social media is causing us to almost devolve to a lower level of functioning. And one thought we've had and would love your thoughts on is, can these tools be used to move back up the brainstem to the higher part of the brain? So are there ways those same tools can be used to have the opposite effect?
Yes, so this is a great question, because there are some behavioral things that we know can help explain why people react the way they do. When a politician comes to the door to ring the doorbell, we know what some of the behavioral effects are, that people respond well to men with deep voices, and women respond well to male candidates, and male voters respond well to female candidates. And there's a range of things that, based on last name and ethnicity, this gets back to the race question. Unfortunately, there are these affinities that seem to pop up on the basis of race and gender and shared experience, accent even. But there are also ways that social media in sort of managed settings can allow people to explore new relationships, to encounter people that are not like them, that they haven't met before. And there have been some very interesting experiments that show that if you do spend time on social media under the right conditions, you move up the brainstem, your horizons expand, you learn new things about what's going on at the other end of the country, or just down the end of the block if you haven't been there in a while. And those experiments, I think, teach us that you can, under the right conditions, build empathy and get to consensus with social media. And sometimes people ask me why I can end up arguing this, because I actually think part of the solution is for more different social media, not less. We're never going to take away Instagram, right, or Facebook or TikTok. We can't take those platforms away or even give them a serious redesign. What we can do is start to integrate, give guideposts for what engineers should be designing to, look for ways in which public agencies can meet people on social media, right? Meet them where they are, in a sense, and set up those conditions in which there's actually some learning and some empathy building across social media and social experiences.
What you just said is hopeful, and we are interested in finding a path forward. You're almost describing what might be called a hope machine or a truth machine that would be the opposite of the lie machines that we're dealing with. So to circle back to that concern for the moment as a way to also remind us why it's important for us to take these actions relative to how social media functions, it's clear you're concerned about protecting democracy. That's clear from the title and subtitle of your book, as are we, as are our listeners. So what would you say are the most important ways that lie machines, as they exist now, undermine and destabilize and threaten democracy itself?
Well, we tend to see the most aggressive or most successful lie machines working well at election times. This is true for democracies around the world. If political leaders do things to try to discourage people from voting or discourage participation, that's an important chunk of content to feed into the lie machine. In democracies around the world, sometimes we've seen coordinated campaigns to prevent people from showing up on election day, or to hide where the polling stations are, to discourage people from running for office. Unfortunately, that last point is often particularly targeted against female candidates, women community leaders who want to run for office. Unfortunately, it can be easy to discourage them or drive them out of public life using social media. So I think democracies, there's a saying, perhaps it was Winston Churchill, that democracy is the best of the worst systems, right? Or it's the worst system, but it's still better than all the others. I think there are important ways in which it's useful to have diversity in the ballot box. It's useful to have voters learn a little bit about the rest of their district, right? And try to build some ties across class and race. And social media can help with that stuff. Which is why I guess I go back to my earlier point that I don't think we can extract social media tools or machine learning from the news cycle, but integrating it in healthy ways should be the goal.
So many of our listeners are public officials and also other kinds of engaged citizens, and their work is to restore and build pro-social communities. It can feel like an uphill battle to communicate effectively across divisions when so much of what people consume is via social media. So we're wondering what advice you would give a government official in the U.S. or another civic leader or engaged citizen when it comes to how to bridge that gap, communicate across those divisions in the current environment.
I think in the current environment, it's probably best to treat this a little bit like a diet, a news diet. So spending a little bit of time on social media every day, getting comfortable with the platform of choice that you have, contributing a little and then a little bit more. Those are probably among the information habits that most modern public officials need now. Now, lots of caveats there. It's 15 minutes. It's not an hour or hours. And it's one or two social media platforms, not all of them. I mean, you don't need to micromanage your identity online unless you're actually running for office. Then maybe you do. But for the most part, this is about getting comfortable with social media that teaches you a little bit about where your community is, being lightly engaged. And then, so along with that regular habit, probably also communicating with evidence. So sharing links to what you think are the credible resources for things. Using professional journalism when it's relevant, using direct links to the government papers when it's relevant, not sharing things that are conspiratorial, extremist, or sensationalist, right? That's always valuable. I imagine there's a special, what's the right word? Bravery that's needed, right? Because you need to be present. This is the public square now, but you don't need to engage with all of the trolls over the narrowest little thing. And it can be hard. People often try to goad you into arguments or goad you into conversations. It can be hard to ignore sometimes. But knowing when to reply with one tweet, with a link to what is the sensible policy paper, but then pausing, not sending more, that's probably a learned practice. That's probably something that's just learned with practice. So a little bit of regular engagement, a healthy diet of some, but not too much social media, and learning to curate what you say and what you contribute with a positive tone. Those are probably among the things that I'd recommend.
And building on that, what are some ways in which you, in your own institution, in your work, help organizations think about that civic engagement, the ways in which you connect more directly with people? So that balance of some social media, but what does it show or end up looking like in the real world? Are there pieces that you're offering to folks that can be helpful to them as leaders trying to connect in their community?
We have a tool called the Navigator Tool, and I'll happily share that with you at the end of our podcast. It's got a collection of tools and guides, user guides across several languages for how to engage. It's mostly for public policymakers and civil society groups, for how to engage over social media, how to deal with misinformation campaigns when they arise, and when they're active in your particular issue area. And I think there's a couple of best practices that people talk about: having a regular engagement pattern, like we just discussed, being careful to read before you share, and not engaging a little bit, not too much, in a public setting with the people who are directly opposite, arguing exactly the opposite of what you're trying to promote. I think an important step is also appreciating that as public officials, I think you have a reasonable expectation to be able to work directly with the social media firms on problems that are rising on their platforms. And, in a given moment, in a political crisis or in the middle of an election, that might mean knowing who to call at Facebook, knowing who the Facebook representative in your city or your state is in your national capital. And it might mean knowing who the lobbyist or the PR staffer is, but it might mean knowing who the policy person is or knowing somebody on the engineering team who can help in a moment of crisis when some policy issue is clearly going to go off the rails because of something erratic that's happened, whether it's foreign interference or something odd domestic source. So being able to have that go after that direct relationship with the firms, I think is part of what a modern public bureaucracy needs to be able to have. It should be able to claim.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think what your advice is providing is a way for leaders to get a little bit unstuck. I think there's, so much happening right now and folks are struggling a bit to think about the best path forward. And so really taking some of those concrete steps and putting them in place, I think is helpful. I've heard you mention an algorithmic audit. Can you tell us what that is? And do you think it could be helpful for leaders in the public sector?
I do. I think it's important for algorithmic audits to be run independently. So it should be independent researchers. And I don't think that this is something that should fall on civil society to do. But algorithmic audits would allow us to have a much better understanding of the relationship between the data that we generate, the stories that professional journalists generate, and what actually arrives in our inbox, or what we actually see on a day-to-day basis. I think most of us now know that we follow lots of people, we have lots of friends and family, but we don't actually see all of their content. What's shown to us is a curated microcosm of our social world, but the social media platforms won't really tell us how that curation works. And we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years that sometimes conservatives think it's biased towards them or against them. Sometimes liberals think it's biased towards them or against them. And it's very difficult to know from the outside. At the moment, we believe that most of the social media platforms use a combination of machine learning and human curation to identify hate speech, to catch the nasty stuff, child porn or messages related to human trafficking. All that stuff is caught by a combination of tools, but we don't fully know. We don't really have we don't have sight of what their organizational process is or their algorithmic process is for identifying this harmful content.
Thank you for what you've shared with us. I'm thinking about a partnership that you might be pointing toward between public sector organization, NGOs, and scholars and scholarly institutes and institutions like the Oxford Internet Institute. One theme that's opened up in our interviews is the importance of continuing to learn and to continue to take different perspectives in order to really understand the complexity of what we're dealing with. And your institute is clearly a great resource for our listeners. Wondering what you might recommend that our listeners who want to continue to learn more, what might they read, what might they listen to in order to build on what you shared today?
Well, we are 5 or 6 years into this now, and I think pretty much every university has some kind of lab working on misinformation of some kind. Most of the major universities in state capitals are tracking issues that seem to be getting poisoned by trolls. And then for some of the big issues that cut across the nation, like COVID, health, vaccination, messaging, and COVID-related misinformation, that there are several institutes that are good sources of information. So I guess I'd say be sure to explore in your own state what the nearby resources are. Because I bet you there's a local fact-checking group, a couple of academics and professional journalists who are used to working independently, who will have something to say or will have some advice on things to watch within the state. And then there's a handful of centers at the University of Washington, the University of Texas, University of Virginia has a great new outfit studying national level information operations. I think figuring out what kinds of sources you want for yourselves on the trends here will be valuable. Fortunately, misinformation tends to peak around election time. So this is a particular challenge for your colleagues who do elections administration. And I think part of planning for running an election is going to involve learning to defend the good processes that are already in place, making the rules clear, and being ready to engage on social media, because that's going to be one of the, hot button sort of meta issues in misinformation for the next few years.
I'm curious if you were sitting down and having a beer with a person who is a public communicator. So this could be an appointed or an elected official, and you had the chance to give one piece of advice that you would hope would stick for that individual around this whole admittedly very complex set of topics. What might you say to her or him or them?
I would say to not be afraid to speak to truths, but to be ready to defend them. I do think people go into public service because you have a sense of what's broadly true or of the value of evidence, and a sense of, wanting to solve some social injustice or fix a public problem, right? Fix something, make the quality of life better for the people around you. Those are common values, right, across for people who go into public service. So being proud of the things that you're confident in, that you know are true, that are the trends that are true, that are based in data, the latest polling data, the latest census data, the latest survey data. Those things you should be proud of and not be afraid to state and to put out over social media. I would say, though, that now we need to be ready with our citations and ready to back it up and ready to explain, so we don't editorialize without having our evidence at hand, and taking care to just the way you would prepare a good public policy document, with making sure your citations are in place and you have your evidence. We need to be ready with that kind of truth trail when we do our social media engagement.
I love that, truth trail. That's a great way to bring our conversation to an end. And I think your comments around the partnerships with universities and academia is such an important part of how the collective, right, really needs to defend our institutions and find that path forward that really brings the best of our interactions through social media to the forefront. So appreciate that. We appreciate you spending so much time with us, Bill. This has been a fantastic conversation, as we knew it would be, and we'll continue to look to your insights and learn from you as we go ahead.
Wonderful. Thanks for a great conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our Dream Deferred, Fulfilling the Nation's Promise is an APHSA production, hosted by Tracy Waring-Evans and Karen Key, editing and sound design by me, Brandon Mitchell. Our team also includes Christina Becker, Jenny Hogan, and Jessica Guerin. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.